Well, good morning, everybody. What a great opportunity, and I'm so pleased to be here this morning to speak, and I do appreciate the opportunity to kind of squish this in, so I apologize for you having to get started early. But we did have an opportunity actually to swap things back and forth, and here we are making it happen. It is a pleasure, and I understand the governor was here yesterday, very exciting. The governor, where we really are blessed to have an individual in a place of leadership that really does recognize where we are and why it's important that we address some of the issues that we're addressing. And while the goals may seem very aggressive, as a military commander, past military commander, if you don't make the goals aggressive enough, they're not worth fighting for. So we have to be able to start the conversation, and that's kind of what I'm out doing currently, bringing 30 years of experience and trying to focus the attention on something a little bit different. So let me get started here because we got 20 minutes. Yeah. Okay. The mission of the center, we're located in San Diego, California. I have an office here in LA, just on 7th Avenue, and I have an office in Oakland. But we operate in 5 different states, and our job is to accelerate the transition to a sustainable world powered by clean energy. And that's kind of what we do. We run programs, everything from customer to regulator is the gambit in which we actually operate. Heavily engaged with the ARB. We run California's Clean Vehicle Rebate Project. We also run Massachusetts and soon to run Connecticut's. So we're going to run their programs as well. But it's exciting to be here, and primarily because I now do things a little bit differently. Before I raised my right hand and said I support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that's what it is that I'm all about. But today, I'm a little more selfish about my reasons for my day-to-day activities, and these are primarily those reasons. These are my 3 grandchildren. So a lot of what I do today and a lot of my speaking engagements are all about trying to get the rest of America engaged in an adult conversation that looks at the issues that we are leaving our grandchildren. And more importantly, addressing the concerns that we have from a security perspective, not just as a nation, but as a species on the face of the earth. And why it's so much more important that we have a deliberate adult conversation and not an arithmetic approach at looking at it. And I say this often, that we human beings like to have simple, very much basic, 1 + 1 = 2. And we are not ready as a mathematician. You start with arithmetic and you get all the way to differential equations and much further, where complex variables and equations don't necessarily end up with numbers, but another equation. Well, this is where we need to be, because talking here is not going to get us where we need to be in order to secure their future. And when you look around, you have to say, just how sustainable are we? I live in America's finest city. That's their mantra. Sorry, LA, but it is. But when you look around, you say, just how sustainable are we in our practice? And you have to really sit back and say, you know what? If you look at what's happening around the globe and you understand what's happening, not very. So much so that it's got to the point where senior military officials, Sam Locklear, a good friend of mine, Pacific Theater commander, actually made testimony in the Congress that said that climate change is the biggest long-term security threat to the country, short North Korea. And we know how to deal with North Korea. This is the first time that a 4-star, a theater commander, has actually gone to the Congress and said, hey, wake up. This is a big deal, and we are going to be affected by it. And experts agree, from academicians to senior military political individuals who have engaged in an opportunity to have an adult conversation about what the future holds if we are not more careful in how we approach the future. And if you've not seen these 2 studies, these are just the quick ones. Both of them are available online. The second one, the national security finding, is 13 4-star flag officers who were pulled together by the Center for Naval Analysis, called the MAB, the Military Advisory Board, to create a paper that basically says, look, if you take a look at everything that's happening and you understand where these are, These guys were all theater commanders responsible for the geopolitical stability within those regions. We're in a world that hurts. If we are not more careful about what's going on, look at Nepal. Look what happened in Nepal. Guess who the first person to get called to come help was? Every month, the United States gets 6 calls from around the globe for assistance. That's not changed since I was in the Joint Staff. I actually was the Humanitarian Relief Disaster Assistance Officer on the Joint Staff from 1992 to 1995. This is a major issue because that's who we are. That's what we're doing. But we have to look at everything collectively. So I say, let's take a look. Let's start from the very beginning. First and foremost, if you put a chart of mankind on the face of the globe, and you said the Earth started at day 1, Big Bang, to today, how long do you think man has been on the face of the Earth relative to that 1-year scale? Any ideas? 14 seconds. 14 seconds man has been on the face of the Earth. But look what's happened in that time frame. Rainforests are vanishing. Deforestation is now beginning to occur at rampant scales because of climate change. Deforestation in Africa is occurring at 3 times the rate because of climate change than what man's impact is on the rest of the world. And then you take a look at the habitat that it virtually exists in with that time. Now, for all practical purposes, we've done a terrible job of protecting what it is that we've been given. He gave us dominance, but I don't think he meant to the point of destruction. More animals have gone extinct in my lifetime than in the previous 1,800 years. And every single day, 10 species are added to the endangered list. Just think about it. What does our zoo look like for my grandchildren's children at this pace? Our oceans, the very birthplace of life. What do we do? Do we really understand our impact on what this really means? Because we're not doing a very good job. As a matter of fact, today, from 50 years ago, 97% of the adult fish population has been fished out of our oceans. We are down to 3% of the adult population that was there just 50 years ago. Large portions of our oceans are dead because of our impact. But yet 70% of the world's population receives its principal protein from the ocean. And the further you get into the Pacific and the islands, the closer you understand the impact of how that fishing affects their security. And mankind is using its oceans as its wastebasket. Virtually all of our trash that we don't want to, as a matter of fact, I walked here this morning from the DoubleTree Hotel and actually watched and witnessed just how disrespectful we are in understanding what impact this has. People were out sweeping the street with a huge bucket, but she chose to sweep her trash heap into the curb, virtually into the street, so that it will get washed into the drains, which eventually ends up in our oceans. It's destroying our oceans. The North Pacific Gyre is 2 times the size of the state of Texas. It's our waste baskets. Everything that you throw into the ocean ends up in these areas, and it is having devastating effects. The aquatic birds are actually picking up our trash, thinking that they're small fish, and we are eliminating our aquatic birds throughout the Pacific. And it's affecting many, many more species. But this is the result of a gyre that washed up after a storm on a Pacific island. This is us. This is what we're doing to our plentiful and bountiful source of life. The world is in the midst of its second major doubling. So if you've not had an opportunity to take a look at where we are, and you think things are getting a little crowded, well, guess what? Between now and 2050, the world is expected to add an additional 2.4 billion people to the face of the earth. Not in the industrialized world, but in the underdeveloped and non-industrialized world. That is the equivalent of adding a China and India to the face of the globe. Think about it. And global hunger is on the rise today because of change. So from a geopolitical stability prospect, 14.7 million refugees in northern Africa are now being handled by the UNHCR, and you see what's happening in the Mediterranean as people begin to flee the crisis of North Africa into Europe. And then you look at us. And it's not a slam on us, but it's a recognition that, again, we have to have an adult conversation. Every day, the United States throws out more food than the entire continent of Europe consumes. And I chose Europe because they're not a third world nation. They're not starving. But yet we dispose of more food every day than they consume. As a matter of fact, we throw out 40% of everything we produce. That's equivalent of growing every square inch of Mexico, cultivating it, watering it, taking care of it, harvesting it, packaging it, transporting it, and throwing it out. But this is the way the rest of the world is. And when you start looking at what happens when this happens, this is Somalia, 1983. If you understand what's really happening in Syria, you'll understand that this has nothing to do with the outcomes of the civil unrest that we are all now experiencing. It has to do with the fact that Syria, the heart of Syria, is the breadbasket of the Middle East. And it is in the midst of a 17-year drought. It is the hottest place on the face of the earth. And its government has left 3.8 million farmers to fend for themselves. In the next 40 years, with the population explosion that I just explained to you, we will have to produce more food on the face of the earth than mankind has in the last 10,000. So from time of creation to 1850, it took us that long to get to 1.5 billion people. From 2014 to 2050, we're going to go from 7.2 to 9.4. 10,000 years of production necessary to feed the masses. And then we get to the basic elements of life itself, and that's water. And we're in a world of hurts. There are more than 300 million people in India who have never seen a drop of fresh water. But yet India is one of those nations who are expanding their population in double digits. 85% of the world's population lived in the driest regions of the world. So as climate change takes effect, what does it have to say about what those statistics then hold for us when you consider water is the basic element in which none of us can survive without? You can go 30 days without food. The body can't go 3 days without water. And things are bad and getting worse. This is a picture of Folsom Lake in 2011 and 2014. Folsom Lake is dry. Not a good situation to be in, especially when you recognize that at the end of that lake is a hydroelectric dam, which is no longer producing renewable energy. California has lost 13% of its renewable hydroelectric capacity in the last 2 years because of drought. And when the Colorado River and Lake Mead dry up in 20 months from now, the largest hydroelectric capacity in the country will cease to produce energy. Crisis yet? Well, it's not just here. It's happening across the globe. In Sao Paulo, Brazil is a megacity of the world. It is the first city in the world's population that is actually going through a planning process of depopulating. 21 million people and no water in the heart of the Brazilian rainforest. What does the geopolitical instability then create as the second economic engine of South America fold? And devastation on a grand scale has happened in the last 5 to 7 years, and nobody seems to know just how bad things really are. Australia is in the midst of its 15th year of drought, and in 2010, Australians had to make the difficult decision of whether or not to provide water for themselves or for their animals. This is a farmer surveying his field, in which he made the decision, obviously, for himself, but he's surveying his sheep herd after they've died in the field. More than 10,000 animals were left to die in the field in Australia. And if we're not careful, the consequences of what we have to deal with are much larger than we realize. Last year, California dairy farmers went to the governor and said, "Governor, if we don't have an allocation different than what is currently being ordered by the court, 35% of California dairy farms could potentially close their doors." California is the 5th largest producer of milk in the world. So where do you think you'll get a gallon of milk for $2.99? And we are a very wasteful culture. We waste 7 billion gallons a day, and importantly enough, 20% of California's energy is produced just for water, of which 40% of it goes down the drain, never having been used for its intended purpose. So add that to your carbon metrics. 20%, 40% waste down the drain. And we really do have to have a much more deliberate conversation about climate and stop focusing on the particular weather events. As a climatologist, I'm a meteorologist and oceanographer by degree. Climate is something you measure over 30 to 100 years. Climate is something you measure over 30 to 100 years. Weather is something that occurs on an hourly basis. It is the collision of air masses. It is the movement that occurs that creates the cataclysmic events we call weather. It's that simple. The changes are a result of climate change. It is a factor of global warming. And we do have to recognize that our climate is changing faster today than it has in the past 65 million years. 10 times faster. So much so that the variables of the model no longer maintain equilibrium. And that's a serious factor when you consider that as a scientist, you look for the equation so that you can forecast. But when the variables are changing in an exponential fashion, the model no longer works. And this is where we are in our climate. And it has a major impact on where and what we are doing. Sea level rise, even at a minimum of 17 inches, is devastating to the face of the globe, and it's not that small when you consider that many portions of the world are just 4 to 5 feet above current sea level. Our ice caps are melting at a dramatic rate. You can see here 30%. For the first time, the United States is now building into its strategy a presence in the Arctic. Why? Because Russia and other nations have claimed the pole. And they have made a determination that they are going to put people on the pole so that they can declare the economic prosperity that exists under this long, long, barren resource pool. And it's not just sea level rise that we have to worry about. It's the catastrophic event that happens when a storm occurs. 80% of the storms in last year's hurricane season or typhoon season were type 2 or better. Categorically and statistically, not too very relevant. But when you consider 17 inches of rise and a category 2 storm being the prevalent, you start to recognize that if that were to happen across the major islands of the Philippines, in a simple day, 12 million refugees would be created. This is Miami, just 4 feet above, only 12 feet from here, and this is the Philippines, December the 4th of last year, leaving 1.28 million people as homeless. Simple storm. And oh, by the way, the Philippines is still a protector of the United States. Who do you think they come to for help? Our wants and our needs need to get in balance. We need to figure out what we got to do, and it starts right here because fossil fuels are the very crux by which we define ourselves. And you can see here, this is the chart and where we are with regards to peak oil, where we are with demands, where we are in production, and more importantly, this is a diagram for what potentially will be the most dangerous century of mankind's history, if we don't start having a more serious conversation. Because that's where we are today. We have to start having a more deliberate conversation about how renewables blend into our process and being more aggressive about how to introduce technologies that allow for the adoption of those technologies for the solutions that are currently being used as the enemy of success. Solutions are at hand, and I'm very proud to be now residing in California, because California is one of those places where when I meet with other people, I say, don't look at the United States as an answer to your solution. When I talked with the president of Thailand, and we talked with the Burmese, we've had conversations with Panama, we've had conversations with a couple of the islands in the Caribbean. I said, don't look at the United States. Don't gauge your prosperity and your opportunity on the United States. Look at California. You can do this differently. You don't have to look at the United States as a model. And if Californians can live the way they are, America's finest city, boasting 33% renewable energy and working its way towards 50, so too can you, because you're not the fifth or the fourth or the third largest economic engine in the world. We are. And we can get there from here. I shared the podium not too long ago with a senator who said, look, Jimmy Carter stood up on the podium and said, 20 years from today, America will be at 20% renewable solar. And he said, look, what a joke. We're less than 0.5%. We're maybe a little bit more than a full percent. What a joke. I think it's all a hoax. And when I got an opportunity to get to the podium, I said, Senator, not being disrespectful, but if the United States had looked more like California, we'd be at 33%, far in excess of President Carter's goals. It's about how you approach the problem and recognize what's there, and that's where we are. We need to bring storage capacity to the forefront. If we're going to provide renewables as a solution, we've got to figure out how to make it happen. We've got to understand that we can't be as wasteful in our resources as we have been. We need to be smarter. We can't throw away 60% of our water in agriculture, in aspects of which nobody, I mean, if you don't have an almond in your entire life, what will be the difference? But it is the most, and I realize that this is lives and other things, but it is the most water-intensive crop in California. We have to make more adult conversation about this. And we need to be much more mindful of our resources. We're throwing out 1,600 pounds, and 70% of this is our packaging. It has nothing to do with the product that we need. It has everything to do with us getting it to market. And then we throw it out. Imagine the resources necessary to produce that waste. We need to think about residential and distributed energy. We need to look at colleges, universities, and campuses. We need to understand that every single reduction and change counts. And yeah, I know the bullet train's a controversial effort, but it ain't new. As a matter of fact, Japan is retiring its first bullet train. It's now 30 years old. Every wheel doesn't have to be invented here. And we need to be much more smart about engaging the rest of what's necessary, because the real crux and why I do what I do every single day, again, is my 3 kids. I spent 33 years in the Navy. I spent 9 extended deployments, 6 of those to the Persian Gulf region, 2 specifically. And when I look back on my history, I say, you know what? I really did most of what I did in the service to protect access to resources in which we have no ultimate control. Hence the reason today. If you think gas prices are going to stay here, you need to go back and take a look at the economics. And what's really sad is the way that we're approaching it from a firefight perspective is about as stupid from a military and a strategic perspective as I have ever heard. If you're in a firefight and your logistics train is cut off, the last thing you do is tell your troops to expend as much ammo as you possibly can, hoping that you're going to win, knowing damn well that the enemy has more than 700 years in reserve. So when we exploit every inch and every barrel and every ounce of our resource that we currently hold, each of our particular enemies hold 100+ years more reserve. So where is the security for the nation? And when they're growing at 6 times the rate that we did, what is the intersection for conflict? Because the 20th century was the bloodiest century in mankind's history. All evolving around the access to resources, every single one of them. I have a degree in strategic studies and international relations. I studied war from the Peloponnesians to the one I was in. Every single one of them were all about the access to resources. And you can see by this chart, the undeveloped nations are moving at a pace that is staggering to what it took us 4 centuries to build. And they're moving from 15th century to 21st century overnight. The iWatch is not going to have an explosive opportunity here in the United States, but it is forecast to have an explosion in the billions in China. Look at the forecasts. This is where we're moving. We have to be more understanding. My son is currently serving, and he's been in uniform for 13 years. Every day of his service life has been at war. Every single day of his service life has been at war. The last time this nation was at war for 13 years, we secured our independence. I say it's time we start looking at this as a war for independence. Because if we don't, this may not be our place. I'm absolutely certain that if we're not more careful, and if we don't understand the trail associated with our alliance on fossil fuel for our existence, and what it means for our security, and how we go about protecting and defending ourselves, we are in a world of hurts. So, oops, that's not necessary. So I leave you with this. I'm going to leave and have a movie. There's a movie called The Burden. It was a movie put together by Mr. Sorkin with cooperation from the Truman National Security Project and Operation Freedom. It is a 40-minute presentation of which you're going to see 6 minutes of it, 6 or 8 minutes of it this morning, which hopefully highlight the emphasis being placed on our requirement to be fossil-free for our security. It is made up of individuals who are currently serving and have served, defended this great nation, and are very, very concerned about where we are going. And more importantly, how, if we don't understand the disconnect necessary from fossil fuels for our existence into the future, the security and the security of our children and our grandchildren are at risk. So I ask you to have a more deliberate conversation. Think about the things that I've told you today, because from a strategic commander's perspective, if you engage, and I'm a huge student of Sun Tzu, if you engage the enemy on a single front, you are sure to lose. If you understand the landscape and engage the enemy on all fronts, you are more likely to be victorious. we have to understand that there is more than one aspect in solution. Thanks very much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the movie.